All right, platoon leader. Let's talk shop. You know how to maneuver your squads, lay down fire support, the everyday stuff.
Right.
But have you ever stopped to think, how does all of that connect to the larger fight? How does what you do in a firefight or on patrol play into the bigger picture of how the Army operates?
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're diving into today with FM30.
And we're not just talking about a dusty old manual here.
Definitely not.
Think of FM30 as the Army's constantly evolving playbook for how we fight in a multi-domain world, on land, in the airspace, and even cyberspace.
It's a lot to take in.
It is! And while the manual itself might focus on large-scale combat, trust me, the principles inside are crucial for any leader, at any level, even at the platoon level.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What are the fundamental building blocks of combat power that FM30 lays out?
It all starts with the 6 warfighting functions: command and control, movement and maneuver, intelligence, fires, sustainment, and protection.
6. That's a lot to keep track of.
It sounds like a lot, but it's really just a common sense breakdown of everything the Army does to accomplish its mission, and you're already doing them every single day as a platoon leader. Think about it. You coordinate those supply runs to keep your platoons stocked right.
Absolutely. Can't operate without those.
Exactly. And that, right there, is sustainment in action. Of course, at higher levels, it's about ensuring entire brigades have the fuel, food, and ammo they need, but the core concept is the same.
So it's taking what we already do and making sure it's happening at every level.
Exactly. Now, within those 6 functions are the 5 dynamics of combat power: leadership, firepower, information mobility, and survivability. These are what really bring combat power to life on the battlefield.
Okay, so let's break those down, starting with leadership. We all know good leadership is absolutely critical at the platoon level, but what does that look like when we scale it up to a larger fight?
It becomes even more crucial. You know how much your leadership impacts your squad leaders? Multiply that exponentially. That's the kind of influence a battalion or brigade commander needs to have. They're setting the tone for thousands of soldiers, inspiring them, making those high-pressure decisions that impact the entire operation.
It's like the higher you go, the bigger the ripple effect of your leadership, both good and bad.
You got it.
Okay. What about firepower? That one seems a bit more straightforward. More guns, bigger booms.
It's actually a lot more nuanced than just raw destructive force. While firepower certainly includes those things, it's also about precision coordination and making sure it's applied effectively. Remember that time your platoon's movement was hampered by that dense forest? You had to adjust your plan, find a way to maneuver? Now imagine an entire armored brigade trying to navigate that same terrain. It highlights how even with all the firepower in the world, if you can't get to the fight or use it effectively, it's practically useless.
So mobility or lack thereof can really make or break your firepower.
Exactly. And that's where those warfighting functions we talked about come back in intelligence, to understand the terrain engineering, to overcome obstacle sustainment, to keep everything moving. They all work together. And we can't forget about information. Knowing the battlefield is just as critical as maneuvering on it. In some ways, it's even more important.
You've got a point. There's nothing worse than being blindsided by the enemy because you didn't have the full picture.
Exactly. And that actually segues perfectly into the next part of FM30, which is all about understanding how our adversaries operate.
Okay. Bring on the bad guys.
Well, in this case, we're talking about peer threats. Adversaries who possess capabilities similar to our own. These aren't your average opponents.
So how does that change the game? What are we up against with these peer threats?
The big difference is they aren't playing by the old rulebook. They're using unconventional tactics that are specifically designed to exploit any weaknesses and offset our strengths.
Okay, so what are some examples of these unconventional tactics?
FM30 outlines 5 key threat methods: information warfare systems, warfare preclusion, isolation, and sanctuary. These methods all leverage advantages that go beyond traditional military strength, targeting the very fabric of how we operate.
And let's break those down, starting with information warfare. What does that even mean in this context?
Think of information warfare as weaponizing information itself. Imagine a coordinated effort to flood your comms with false intel, making it seem like reinforcements are coming from the west when they're actually coming from the east.
Wow. Talk about a recipe for disaster. So it's like psychological warfare, but for the digital age.
It is. Information warfare is about sowing chaos, confusion, and distrust within your ranks and among the civilian population, which can be just as damaging as any bullet. Then you have systems warfare, which is all about identifying and exploiting the links in your combat power to make the whole system fall apart.
Okay, so how would that play out in a real-world scenario?
Think of it like this. You have individual squads, each with their own strength, but they rely on communication logistics, fire support, all those warfighting functions we talked about. To be effective systems warfare is about identifying those critical links and disrupting them. Remember the 2014 incident in Ukraine? A Ukrainian brigade was hit by a devastating multi-layered assault.
I vaguely remember that. It was a pretty brutal attack, wasn't it?
It was a brutal example of systems warfare in action. They didn't just hit the brigade with overwhelming force. They used drones for targeting electronic warfare to disrupt their communications. And they even positioned their rocket launchers within their own borders, creating what FM30 calls a sanctuary.
So they created a situation where they could attack with impunity, but made it almost impossible for the Ukrainians to respond effectively. That's devious.
It's a classic example of systems warfare, and it highlights how our adversaries are thinking about the battlefield in a completely different way.
Okay, so you mentioned the term sanctuary. What does that mean exactly?
A sanctuary is all about putting yourself out of reach of enemy forces, either geographically or operationally. It could be using your own borders as a buffer, exploiting international laws to prevent retaliation, or even manipulating public opinion to deter a counterattack. You're essentially creating a safe haven from which you can operate.
I can see how that would make it incredibly difficult to respond, especially for a platoon leader on the ground who has to weigh those risks.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these concepts is so crucial. You're not just reacting to the enemy's actions. You're trying to anticipate their moves, understand their goals, and make the best decisions you can with the information you have.
Okay, so systems warfare is about breaking us apart. What about preclusion?
Preclusion is a strategic checkmate. It's about making moves that limit your options before you even have a chance to act. Imagine you're about to launch a counterattack, but the enemy has intentionally targeted a nearby dam, and now you have to factor in the possibility of massive flooding if you proceed. That's preclusion,
They're forcing you to make a choice, but all the choices are bad.
essentially. And if they can combine preclusion with isolation, the effects are amplified even more.
Okay, so isolation is about cutting off communication support reinforcement.
Exactly. Think about how crucial it is for you to have reliable comms with your squad leaders and higher headquarters. Now imagine that line of communication being jammed, compromised, or completely silent. You're operating in the dark, unsure of what's happening around you, unable to call for support or reinforcements.
And that's not even considering the potential psychological impact on your soldiers. Being cut off and alone in a hostile environment can be devastating to morale.
Absolutely, and that's just one example. Isolation can also mean being physically cut off from supply lines, reinforcements, or even just accurate information. And don't forget the informational aspect. They can use disinformation to turn allies against us, or even manipulate our own public opinion to erode support for a mission.
So it's not just about physical isolation. It's about creating a sense of doubt, confusion, and distrust, both on the battlefield and back home.
Exactly. It's about creating a strategic advantage by making us hesitate, doubt, and ultimately make mistakes. They're playing a multi-domain chess match, and we need to be prepared to do the same.
So we're facing some pretty savvy adversaries who are bringing a whole new playbook to the fight. But here's the thing. No platoon is an island. We're not in this alone, right?
That's exactly right. The Army recognizes that we're stronger when we work together, which is where the concept of unified action comes in.
Okay, so what does that mean in practical terms?
Unified action is about different parts of the military and even civilian organizations working together seamlessly towards a common goal.
So we're talking joint operations with the Air Force, Navy, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And think about it. You've already got experience with this at the platoon level.
Mm.
Remember that time you called in air support or coordinated with a nearby unit for fire support? Those are small-scale examples of joint operations. At higher levels, it's about integrating those capabilities on a much larger and more complex scale.
Right, because air power without ground intelligence is just flying blind. You need those boots on the ground to paint the full picture.
That's the idea behind unified action, leveraging the unique strengths of each branch to achieve something greater than any one service could accomplish alone. And it's not just about firepower. Think about the importance of logistics communications, intelligence gathering. All those elements have to work together seamlessly regardless of which branch is handling them.
And what about coordinating with allies? I imagine that adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. We call that multinational operations, and it's a crucial part of modern warfare. You've already got experience working alongside other platoons in your company, right?
For sure. That's bread and butter.
Well, imagine that same level of coordination, but with a platoon from another country. Maybe speaking a different language, using different equipment, and having different tactical doctrines.
Wow, yeah. That definitely adds a whole new level of difficulty to the mix.
It does. It requires a whole other level of communication, shared understanding, and trust building to be effective. But when it works, it's an incredible force multiplier.
It really highlights how important those seemingly small things, like clear communication protocols and understanding different perspectives, are even at the platoon level.
Without a doubt, those small things scale up. Think about the times you're coordinating fire support with your company mortars, making sure everyone's on the same page to prevent friendly fire. Now imagine that complexity multiplied when you're working with a squadron of F-35s or a Navy destroyer offshore.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it. It makes you appreciate the importance of those clear lines of communication and shared understanding, even in the heat of the moment.
Absolutely. Unified action only works when everyone is on the same page, regardless of their uniform or nationality.
Okay, so we've talked about joint operations, which is bringing together different branches of the U.S. military in multinational operations, which adds allies to the equation. But what about those higher levels of command within the Army itself? How does FM3 break down that chain?
Think of it like a ladder with each rung representing a different echelon of command. You start at the very bottom with the individual soldier, then move up to the squad, platoon, company, battalion, brigade, combat teams, and all the way up to the theater army, which is the highest level of command in a specific geographic area of operations.
And each level builds upon the one below it, right?
Yeah.
So the decisions made at the theater army level will eventually trickle down and impact what you're doing with your platoon on the ground.
You've got it. Each echelon has its own specific responsibilities and areas of expertise, but they all work together to achieve the overall strategic objectives.
So, for example, what would a corps be responsible for?
A corps is a massive organization that's responsible for conducting large-scale operations. Think of it like a battalion HQ, but instead of being responsible for a few companies, they're responsible for multiple brigades, potentially tens of thousands of soldiers, and with access to much greater resources like attack helicopters, advanced cyber capabilities, and long-range artillery.
So like a battalion on steroids, but with a lot more firepower and resources at their disposal.
That's a good way to put it. And then you have divisions, which are where those multi-domain operations we discussed really come into play. Remember how you as a platoon leader have to integrate your squad's firepower and maneuver? A division commander does that, but with entire brigades, air support, artillery intelligence assets, and even cyber attacks.
Wow. That's a lot of moving pieces to keep track of. It makes you realize there's always someone operating at a higher level with a broader perspective.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for leaders at all levels to understand their role within the bigger picture.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into FM30, what's the most important takeaway for our platoon leader listening in? What should they be reflecting on?
It all boils down to this. Even though you're leading at a tactical level, your actions are directly connected to those larger strategic goals. What you do with your platoon, the decisions you make, the way you train your soldiers, it all contributes to the bigger picture of how the Army operates.
So it's like that old saying, every battle is won or lost before it's ever fought. Preparation, understanding your place in the bigger picture, and always thinking a few steps ahead. That's what it's all about.
You nailed it. And that preparation goes beyond just knowing your own job. It's about understanding the enemy, anticipating their moves, and being ready to adapt when things inevitably don't go according to plan.
Speaking of adapting, here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Imagine you're leading a reconnaissance patrol, and you suspect enemy jamming is disrupting your comms. How would you adapt your mission knowing what you now know about the threat's use of electronic warfare and the importance of information dominance on the battlefield?
That's where the real learning begins. Taking these concepts from FM30 Unified Action Multi-Domain Operations, those threat methods we discussed, and applying them to your specific scenarios, always thinking one step ahead and never underestimating the importance of staying agile and adaptable in a constantly changing environment.
It's a lot to take in, but as we've seen today, FM30, while complex, offers incredibly valuable insights for leaders at every level. So platoon leaders, I encourage you, dive into this manual, explore these concepts, and prepare to see your role in a whole new light.
Well said. It's about more than just tactics and procedures. It's about understanding the why behind what we do and recognizing that even at the platoon level, you are a critical piece of a much larger and more complex puzzle.